They had crossed the Pacific in the bellies of Liberty ships, crammed together, sick with seasickness and uncertainty. The war had already taken everything from them: comrades, homes, illusions of victory, and now they were prisoners in the hands of an enemy they had been taught to despise. When the ships finally docked and the men were herded into trucks bound for inland America, most expected humiliation, perhaps even cruelty. Instead, they found themselves deposited in camps with wooden barracks, orderly fences, clean bedding, and meals that, while modest, were far better than what many had eaten in the field during the last months of the empire. But the true shock came not from the food or the barracks. It came when the American officers made an announcement that left the Japanese prisoners staring in disbelief. Every prisoner would be allowed to write letters home. For men who had been raised on propaganda about the inhumanity of the enemy, this seemed unthinkable. Letters were a luxury reserved for free men, and in Japan even soldiers at the front often waited months for mail to slip through the chaos of war. The prisoners looked at one another, murmuring in disbelief, some laughing bitterly, convinced it was a cruel joke. Could the Americans really allow captured Japanese to reach across the Pacific and touch their families' lives with words? The thought carried both hope and fear. Hope because families torn apart by war might finally know that their sons and husbands were alive. Fear because what if the Americans only used these letters as weapons, twisting them into propaganda, altering the words before sending them onward? The first day in the camp, an American interpreter explained the process. Twice a month each prisoner would be given sheets of paper and envelopes. The letters would be censored not to change the meaning he assured them but to remove any mention of military details. They would then be passed through the International Red Cross, routed via neutral countries like Switzerland or Sweden, and eventually delivered into the heart of the collapsing empire. The interpreter's calm tone made the prisoners even more suspicious. Many whispered to each other that no enemy would go through such trouble for men who had fought to kill them. It had to be a trick, yet the promise lingered in their minds like a spark in the dark. Some thought of wives left behind in bombed-out cities, of mothers who might not even know if their sons were alive, of children who perhaps had never even met their fathers. A few hardened veterans scoffed at the idea, refusing to be duped. But the younger men, the farm boys and students turned soldiers, could not hide their yearning. If there was even a small chance that their words might reach home, could they risk staying silent? When the first forms were handed out, the barracks fell into an uneasy hush. Men stared at blank paper as if it were more dangerous than a rifle aimed at them. The act of writing felt surreal. After years of orders barked by officers, of lines memorized from propaganda speeches, here was a chance to speak with their own voices. One man's hand trembled so badly he could hardly hold the pen. Another sat frozen, afraid that any wrong word might bring trouble upon his family. Yet as pens scratched against paper, something stirred in the camp. For the first time since capture, they were no longer faceless soldiers or nameless prisoners. They were fathers, sons, and brothers again, tethered by ink to a life that still waited across an ocean and a war. The guards standing by with quiet indifference seemed to confirm the truth. This was not a game. The letters would leave the camp. The prisoners, still doubtful, could not yet believe that their words might truly reach across the Pacific. But a seed had been planted, and in the weeks to come it would grow into one of the most unexpected lifelines of their captivity. The following days brought further explanations delivered with almost bureaucratic precision. An American officer accompanied by a Red Cross representative entered the camp and outlined the regulations. Each prisoner was permitted to send 2 letters and 4 postcards per month. The length of each letter could not exceed a single sheet of paper written on both sides, while postcards had to remain brief. All correspondence had to be in Japanese, clearly legible and addressed only to immediate family members. No mention of troop movements, no descriptions of camp layout, no political commentary were allowed. Any violation would lead to the letter being crossed out with thick black lines or withheld altogether. The Japanese listened in silence, weighing every word. Some prisoners muttered to each other in disbelief. It sounded far too generous, almost absurd. Back home they knew civilians in bomb-shattered Japan were restricted in what they could write, and here as captives they were being granted privileges that seemed unimaginable. A few officers tried to caution the men, whispering warnings that every line was part of an American scheme to make them docile. "Do not trust the paper," one sergeant hissed at his bait. Others, however, pointed out that the Red Cross stood behind this system, and even the most hardened cynics recognized that the neutral Swiss had long been regarded as reliable guardians of wartime mail. When the first official writing day came, tables were set up in the mess hall. Prisoners lined up, each handed a thin pencil, a sheet of paper stamped with the Red Cross emblem, and an envelope already marked with the return address of the camp. For some, the sight of official stationery was enough to stir an ache in their chests. A few simply stared at the page, afraid to start. Others wrote cautiously, rehearsing phrases in their minds before letting them spill onto the paper. A typical opening ran along the lines of "I am alive and in good health. I am treated fairly. Do not worry." It was the kind of formula they thought censors expected, yet beneath these bland words lay torrents of unspoken emotion. The Americans watching from the side noted the mix of suspicion and longing. The act of writing was more than a mechanical task. It was an inner battle. One prisoner later recalled that it felt like walking on thin ice, not knowing whether a single word might doom the letter. Many avoided mentioning the war entirely, focusing instead on memories of home, the apple tree in the garden, the family dog, the sound of church bells in their village. Others tried to offer comfort, assuring their parents that captivity, though humiliating, was not cruel. To them it felt surreal to confess such things when only months earlier they had been fighting to the last bullet in places like Saipan or Iwo Jima. Censors reviewed each page, swiftly striking out forbidden words with neat lines. The Japanese watched as their sentences disappeared. Yet they also saw that most of the text remained intact. This was the first moment when disbelief began to soften. If the Americans intended deception, why let so many details pass? A few days later, prisoners saw bundles of letters collected in sacks, sealed and driven out of the camp. It was proof that something was indeed happening. Their words were on the move. Whispers spread through the barracks. If the letters reached Japan, it would mean not only survival but a chance to be remembered as more than nameless captives. Hope began to mingle with suspicion. For the first time since capture, the prisoners felt that their existence might still ripple across the ocean, landing in the fragile hands of those they loved. The first letters written in those stark barracks carried an awkward weight for men who had spent months or years speaking only the language of orders, strategy, and survival. The shift to private words was staggering. The pencil in their hands seemed foreign, lighter than a rifle, yet it trembled as if burdened with the same gravity. A soldier from Tokyo stared for nearly an hour before he finally scribbled, "Dearest mother, I am alive." That single phrase released a flood of emotion. He wrote of the food, of the clean bunks, even of the strange kindness of guards who offered cigarettes without demand. But as he filled the page, he wondered if any of it would reach her. Others faced different struggles. One man captured during the Pacific battles wrote to a wife who was expecting their first child. He hesitated over every line, uncertain how to address a life he might never see. "If you have given birth," he wrote haltingly, "know that my heart is with you." Another prisoner, a teacher before the war, tried to compose a letter to his students only to remember that correspondence was limited to family. He tore the page in frustration, starting again with a note to his aging father. The camp echoed with sighs, scratching pencils, and the occasional muffled sob as men confronted feelings long buried beneath uniforms. Fear lingered over every sentence. What if the censors interpreted something as a hidden code? What if a careless word endangered loved ones in Japan? Many prisoners confined themselves to sterile, almost mechanical reassurances. "I am healthy. I have food. Do not worry." Yet even stripped of detail, those phrases carried immense weight. In the silence of the barracks, the realization dawned that for families who might have assumed them dead, even the simplest line was life itself. The Americans, accustomed to paperwork, treated the process with routine calm. The letters were stacked, inspected, and packed for delivery. But for the Japanese, each folded sheet represented a lifeline stretching across thousands of miles. The very act of writing stirred memories that blurred the walls of the camp. Men spoke quietly of New Year festivals, of riverside walks, of the smell of rice steaming back home. Some grew almost desperate, filling every inch of space with rushed handwriting as though cramming an entire life into a single envelope. Days turned into weeks as the prisoners waited, unsure if their words would ever cross the ocean. Yet even before replies arrived, the act of writing had changed them. The barracks seemed a little less oppressive. Conversations shifted from endless speculation about the war to shared memories of home. Men who once glared at each other in silence now traded stories of mothers, wives, and children. Hope, fragile and uncertain, began to seep into the camp's atmosphere. For the first time since their capture, they realized they were not cut off from the world. Their existence was no longer buried behind barbed wire. Somewhere far away, someone might soon open an envelope and read their words, learning that they were alive. The fear had not vanished, but it now lived side by side with an unfamiliar emotion: anticipation. Once the letters left the camp, they began a journey that few prisoners fully understood. Bags filled with envelopes were first delivered to military postal centers within the United States, where censors once more reviewed the contents to ensure no hidden codes or military secrets slipped through. Afterward, the bundles were handed to the International Red Cross, whose emblem, even in wartime, carried a kind of sacred neutrality. The prisoners had seen the insignia stamped on their letterheads, but knowing that neutral intermediaries handled their words gave the process an air of legitimacy. Still, the men whispered among themselves, asking whether the mail would actually be allowed to cross into Japan. The logistics were complex. Letters traveled by rail to ports on the East Coast, often New York or Boston, where they were loaded onto ships heading toward the Pacific. Some traveled across the ocean under constant threat, though by the later stages of the war those dangers had diminished. Upon arrival in neutral Switzerland or Sweden, Red Cross officials sorted, bundled, and redirected the mail into Japan's fragile postal system. Each step took weeks, sometimes months, but gradually the letters crept closer to their destinations. Inside the camps, prisoners pieced together rumors of how this system worked. Some had heard that the mail crossed through Lisbon, others swore it was carried via Geneva. A few skeptics still insisted that the sacks never left American soil and were quietly destroyed, but their certainty began to erode as the weeks passed. Too many details matched accounts from the Red Cross, and the Americans appeared unconcerned, even casual about the process. It did not feel like a propaganda trick. It felt like bureaucracy, relentless and methodical. For the Japanese, who had lived under a regime obsessed with secrecy and control, the very idea that their words might sail openly across oceans and borders was extraordinary. They tried to imagine the path their handwriting packed with hundreds of others writing in mailbags, crossing stormy seas, then passed from hand to hand until finally slipping into the wooden mailbox of a home in Tokyo, Osaka, or Hiroshima. The scale of it was overwhelming. Some prisoners began to ask questions of American guards, hoping to glean more information. Occasionally, a sympathetic soldier explained that mail delivery was slow but real. "Be patient," one guard advised, "the words will find their way." That simple assurance carried enormous weight. For men accustomed to lies and propaganda, hearing even a small confirmation felt like proof. The waiting became its own form of torment. Days dragged on as men stared at the camp gates, half expecting a courier to arrive with replies. To fill the silence, prisoners gathered in groups and speculated about when their families might read their words. They wondered whether their mothers still lived in bombed-out neighborhoods, whether wives had survived raids, whether their letters would bring relief or only deepen pain. Despite the uncertainty, a subtle transformation took hold. The act of sending letters turned captivity into something less absolute. The men were no longer isolated figures behind wire. They were participants in a fragile line of communication, a human bridge stretching across continents in the middle of a brutal war. The knowledge that their words might travel further than they could gave them a sense of movement, of life beyond the fences. In a world defined by limits and commands, that was an astonishing freedom. When the first replies finally trickled back into the camps, disbelief rippled through the barracks like a shockwave. Weeks had passed, sometimes months, since the men had nervously scrawled their first hesitant letters. Many had resigned themselves to silence, assuming their words had been lost at sea or intercepted by enemy hands. Then one morning, guards entered carrying bundles of envelopes stamped with Japanese postmarks smudged with the ink of distant towns. Names were called out and trembling hands reached forward to claim the fragile slips of paper. The reactions were immediate and raw. Some men clutched their letters to their chests, unable to open them for fear of what they might reveal. Others tore them apart instantly, their eyes devouring every line. A soldier from Hiroshima collapsed onto his bunk as he read the familiar handwriting of his wife, who described the rubble left by Allied bombing but assured him she was still alive. Another prisoner, barely 20 years old, learned that his mother had wept for days before receiving his first message, but now rejoiced knowing he had survived. For these men the words were not just ink, they were proof that life outside the barbed wire still existed. But the letters also carried pain. One man discovered that his father had been killed during an air raid in Tokyo. Another learned his home village had been flattened, leaving his family scattered across the countryside. Some read about shortages, hunger, and the growing despair of a nation losing the war. These revelations hit harder than any physical hardship of captivity. Yet even grief became a strange form of connection. They were part of their family's struggles, again not cut off in silence. As more replies filtered in, the camp transformed. Conversations no longer revolved solely around rations, chores, or rumors of the front. Instead, men read passages aloud to trusted bunkmates, comparing the handwriting of wives, the cautious optimism of parents, the jokes scribbled by younger siblings. It was as if pieces of Japan had arrived and taken residence in those wooden barracks. For the first time since capture, men laughed together, not at cynical jokes but at familiar stories from home. The Americans observed this with quiet detachment, occasionally amused at the way hardened soldiers softened when clutching their mail. To them the system was simply policy, part of the Geneva Convention and international agreements. To the prisoners it was nothing short of miraculous. That a letter could cross ocean's borders and the chaos of war to land in their hands felt like an act of mercy in a merciless world. Inevitably new questions arose. Could their families safely reply without fear of Japanese authorities? Many knew that in Japan mail was also censored and certain phrases could draw suspicion, yet the fact that replies had arrived at all shattered much of their lingering doubt. Whatever propaganda they had been fed about American cruelty seemed hollow compared to the tangible reality of an envelope carrying a loved one's words. Some began to plan their next letters with more courage, daring to write not only reassurances but personal reflections, fragments of personality that war had nearly erased. The exchange of words became a rhythm, slow but steady like a heartbeat, reminding them that even in captivity they were still connected to a larger world. As the weeks turned into months, the steady arrival of mail reshaped the mood of the camps. Barracks once filled with silence or low murmurs now buzzed with conversation, fueled by the stories that came folded into fragile envelopes. The prisoners who had carried themselves with the stiffness of men waiting for an uncertain fate began to show glimpses of humanity. A father sat on his bunk reading aloud a description of his newborn child, tears streaking his unshaven face as fellow soldiers listened respectfully. Another man laughed uncontrollably after learning that his younger brother had mischievously borrowed his fishing pole back home in Hokkaido, an image so ordinary it felt like a miracle in the middle of war. The letters did not erase suffering, but they altered its texture. Grief mingled with joy in ways that made the camp feel less like a cage. One prisoner who had resigned himself to despair discovered that his wife still waited for him despite their separation. That single fact gave him strength, transforming his daily routines into acts of survival rather than drudgery. Others found renewed purpose in imagining futures beyond captivity, sketching plans for farms, businesses, or studies once peace returned. For the first time their thoughts extended beyond the wire fences. The Americans noticed these changes too. Guards remarked that discipline in the camp improved as men seemed less prone to fights or escape attempts. Psychologists attached to the Army later argued that communication with families gave prisoners a stake in life, reducing hopelessness that could otherwise erupt into violence. Whether intended or not, the flow of letters became a tool of stability as much as a gesture of humanity. The anticipation of mail days became ritual. Prisoners lined up eagerly, hearts pounding as names were read aloud. Some waited in vain, returning to their bunks, empty-handed, faces drawn tight with disappointment. Others clutched multiple envelopes at once, overwhelmed by the abundance of words from home. The emotional disparity was palpable, joy, envy, sorrow, and hope all swirling together under the same roof. Yet even those without letters shared in the atmosphere, gathering around friends to hear passages read aloud and sometimes pretending for a few moments that the words belonged to them too. Perhaps most striking was the subtle shift in how the Japanese viewed their captors. Men who once scowled at American guards began to nod respectfully, recognizing, even if reluctantly, that the enemy had allowed this fragile lifeline to exist. Suspicion did not vanish, but gratitude seeped in quietly, expressed not in words but in softened gestures, calmer routines, and an easing of hostility. It was a paradox that many prisoners struggled to reconcile. They had been taught that America was merciless, yet here they were tracing the handwriting of their families thanks to American policy. In the evenings, the barracks glowed faintly with the light of small bulbs as men reread their letters until the paper began to fray. The words became talismans, proof that the war had not severed every bond. Hope, once a dangerous luxury, became a daily companion. The prison camp was still fenced and guarded, but inside its walls something unexpected had blossomed: connection. Despite the joy letters brought, not everyone accepted them at face value. Among the officers and hardened veterans, suspicion lingered like a shadow. Some insisted the Americans allowed correspondence only to weaken Japanese resolve, to make them pliant and cooperative. "They want you to believe they are humane," one lieutenant muttered, "but it is only to poison your loyalty." Others warned that their families' replies were being altered, rewritten to manipulate emotions. Such whispers spread easily in the tense environment of captivity, feeding on old habits of distrust instilled by years of propaganda. Yet the paper in their hands told a different story. When a prisoner read the unmistakable handwriting of his mother or saw a phrase only his wife could have written, doubts cracked. One soldier recalled a childhood memory his sister mentioned in a reply, a detail so obscure no American could possibly have invented it. Another received a letter scrawled with the hurried penmanship of a father who had never written more than a few words in his life. These authentic touches destroyed the idea of fabrication. Slowly, disbelief began to collapse under the weight of reality. Still, the propaganda effort continued. Senior Japanese officers tried to remind their men of duty to the emperor, framing the American generosity as deceit. They urged prisoners not to be lulled into sympathy, but the more letters circulated, the harder it became to maintain strict discipline of thought. A man who had just read his wife's assurance that she prayed for him daily could not easily reconcile that with orders to hate his captors unconditionally. Another who learned of his children's survival found himself secretly grateful to the system that had delivered such news. American authorities understood the psychological power of the mail, but they did not exploit it crudely. Letters were never altered to insert political messages, nor were families coerced into writing propaganda. The honesty of the process was what made it so effective. By simply allowing natural communication, the United States demonstrated a contrast to the totalitarian rigidity the prisoners had lived under. The freedom to write and to receive words untainted by manipulation became a subtle but profound form of education. Conversations in the barracks reflected this tension. At night, men debated whether America's motives were genuine or strategic. Some clung stubbornly to the idea of deception, but others argued that regardless of intention, the result was real. They knew their families were alive, they had proof of connection, and that mattered more than speculation. Gradually, a shift occurred. Loyalty to imperial ideology weakened, replaced by something simpler and more personal: the desire to survive, return home, and rebuild their lives. For many, this quiet transformation was more powerful than any lecture or leaflet dropped from the sky. The letters themselves became counter-propaganda, unplanned but undeniable. Each envelope carried not just words from loved ones but also an unspoken lesson. The enemy allowed you to write freely, something your own leaders rarely permitted. It was a comparison impossible to ignore even for the most skeptical among them. Years later, when former prisoners of war spoke of their time in America, the memory of those letters surfaced again and again. Men who had endured humiliation in battle-long journeys across the ocean and confinement behind barbed wire often described the moment of holding a letter as the most vivid experience of captivity. The barracks, the guards, even the fences faded in recollection compared to the fragile paper that had bridged continents. "It was the only proof that I was still a human being," one veteran later admitted. The legacy of this correspondence went far beyond temporary relief. For many Japanese prisoners, the letters redefined their perception of the enemy. They had been indoctrinated to see Americans as barbaric, decadent, or soulless, yet it was those very Americans who permitted them to write in their own language, to reach their families, to receive unedited words from home. The freedom to communicate even under censorship rules stood in stark contrast to the system they had fought to defend. Some later confessed that their first doubts about wartime propaganda sprouted from the simple fact that their captors had allowed this act of compassion. The letters also influenced the course of lives after the war. Families who might have believed their sons or husbands dead instead prepared for their return. Children grew up with the knowledge that their fathers, though absent, still lived and thought of them. Wives who received reassurances preserved those scraps of paper like sacred relics, proof of endurance in a time when the future seemed to collapse around them. When the war ended and prisoners were gradually released, many returned to households that had clung to hope because of those very envelopes. Historians later noted that the American policy of permitting mail aligned with Geneva Convention principles, but its impact was far more profound than legal obligation. It offered a lifeline that softened captivity, stabilized camps, and left impressions that endured for decades. In interviews and memoirs, former prisoners often contrasted their treatment in America with harsher conditions in other countries. They spoke of baseball games, decent rations, and occasional work details, but most often they spoke of letters. Letters that had carried them through despair and reconnected them with the world they thought lost. Of course, not every story was one of joy. Some prisoners received news of deaths, destroyed homes, or vanished relatives. Yet even painful letters had value, for they proved that truth could travel across oceans. In a world of propaganda and lies, honesty itself was a gift. To know the real fate of their families, however tragic, allowed them to grieve, to remember, and to imagine rebuilding once freedom returned. In the end, the letters became a legacy of words, fragile, ordinary, yet extraordinary in their effect. They were the written proof that humanity could survive even in the middle of global conflict. For Japanese prisoners in America, the freedom to write and to be heard remained the one miracle they never forgot, a miracle that reshaped how they remembered both captivity and the enemy who had once been faceless.